think what we're going to do is, again, we'll start right now. So good morning, or as I said, good afternoon, everyone. We're doing a little bit of a dance here. One of our panelists is just unfortunately having some minor technical issues. So I'll make a very brief introduction, and then I'm going to turn it over to my partner on this event and allow him to say a few words. So for those of you who don't know, my name is 𝗬𝗏𝗲𝗀𝗀. I'm president of the Canada-Israel Chamber of Commerce. We are a not-for-profit bilateral, we're a not-for-profit organization promoting bilateral trade between Canada and Israel. We host a number of these events throughout the year, working with strategic partners such as we have here today. Very excited about today's event. And I'm going to make a very brief introduction of Elad Travis, who is a senior associate at Bennett Jones. Elad is the leader of the Maple and Honey Group at Bennett Jones. And together today, we are very excited to co-sponsoring this event. So Elad, I'd like to turn it over to you. And again, thank you for working with the Chamber on this event, and thank you for inviting this wonderful panel.
Thank you very much, Oded. Shalom, I'd like to welcome everyone to our webinar on success stories, private investments of Canadians in Israeli tech companies, hosted by the Maple and Honey Forum and the Canada-Israel Chamber of Commerce. As Oded said, my name is Elad Travis, and I'm a lawyer at the National Canadian Law Firm Bennett Jones, together with my colleague Shoub, our moderator today, and Aaron Sunshine. We are co-heads of our firm's Canada-Israel initiative. This webinar is also hosted by Aviram Hazak, a partner at the prominent Israeli law firm Herzog Neeman, and by Oded Gil, the president of the Canada-Israel Chamber of Commerce. Both are speakers today. The Maple and Honey Forum is a LinkedIn forum promoting Canada-Israel investment and partnerships and supporting industries between the two countries. The forum was founded by Bennett Jones and Herzog Neeman, and we currently have 350 members, including leaders in business, finance, technology, academia, and many other fields. The forum is very excited to collaborate with the Canada-Israel Chamber of Commerce on this webinar. And now, turning to the topic of today's webinar. Private Canadian investment in Israeli tech companies is growing. Both the number of deals and the amounts invested in 2020 and 2021 were higher than the 2 years prior. Let me highlight a few notable investment transactions. TELUS Ventures participated in a $30 million investment in 𝗧𝗏𝗄𝗃 Augmented Vision. AWZ Ventures financed data security companies such as NanoLock Security and DeepCube. Shopify invested $30 million in 𝗬𝗏𝗃𝗀𝗀. NA Ventures participated in a $30 million investment in Duality Technology and was a lead investor in the $8 million funding of 𝗬𝗏𝗃𝗁. Igal Ohayon, director at NA Ventures, is a speaker on today's panel. GreenSoil PropTech led a $16 million investment in Home365. Gideon Soesman, co-founder and managing partner of GreenSoil, is also a member of our panel today. The group Ventures invested in Tactile Mobility and Mirato. Sion Balass, co-founder and managing partner of the group Ventures, is a panelist on our webinar as well. There have also been some mergers and acquisitions, notably Nuvei's $300 million acquisition of Simplex CC, Shopify's acquisition of AI fashion search app Don the Search, and Illumina's acquisition of IRG websites. Despite this recent flow of investment, Canadian financing of Israeli tech companies is actually very modest compared to US funding. Although Canada is the world's 10th biggest economy by GDP, trade between Canada and Israel was under $2 billion in 2020. This means that there is a lot of unrealized potential in Israel for Canadian investors. And that's what today's webinar is about. We will discuss the reasons Canadians are investing in Israeli tech companies, which types of companies are on the radar of Canadian investors, and what would make Israeli companies more attractive. reasons why Canadian investment is not realizing its potential in Israel, and how to change that. Benefits for Israeli tech companies to obtain private capital from Canada, and similarities and differences between Canadian and Israeli business cultures. Okay, and now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Ted Shoub, our moderator today.
Thanks very much, Elad. And thank you to the viewers who've joined us, and thank you to our panel members again, Sion Balass of the Group Ventures, Ido Margalit of BetterSeeds, Igal Ohayon of NA Ventures, Gideon Soesman, GreenSoil Investments, and our Maple and Honey Forum co-founder, Aviram Hazak from Herzog, Fox, and Neeman. Let me start off with you, Aviram. I'd like to talk first about investment opportunities in different areas of Israeli technology. So Aviram, you
Ted, we can't hear you. The audio is off.
okay? Hopefully you can hear me now.
Yeah.
Okay, great. I'm not sure where I cut out, but just mentioning where Aviram is.
The beginning of the question. So.
Yeah. So just to start us off, Aviram, can you talk generally about the phenomenon of scaling up of the Israeli tech ecosystem in the last 2 to 3 years? And big picture, what kind of opportunities are being offered to Canadian investors in Israeli tech?
Sure, great question. Thank you very much. It's very happy to be here. It's an exciting webinar, an exciting topic. The Israeli technology ecosystem has been going through a very exciting period for the last couple of years. From Israel, for many years, used to be known as the startup nation, the region of hundreds or even thousands of startups. And that continues. Israel remains a technological powerhouse. The interesting phenomena of the last few years is that we moved from the startup phase into the scale-up phase. Many Israeli companies have grown much bigger. And the direct result of that is that the ecosystem has grown exponentially, and it has reached very significant size already, and that phenomenon continues as we speak. As of today, we have in Israel about 80 certified unicorns, meaning companies that have already completed equity financing rounds, reflecting a valuation of above 1 billion. We probably have at least 40 or 50 companies that are uncertified unicorns. They are going to become unicorns very soon. There is at least similar number collectively of companies at a valuation of between 500 million to $1 billion. We used to call them ponies. And there are hundreds of companies at a valuation of somewhere between 100 million to 500 million. The Israeli technology ecosystem during the first 3 quarters of this year, Israeli companies have raised about $18 billion in private equity financing rounds. This is almost double the number for the entire year of 2020. Israeli technology companies raised $10 billion, and that considered to be a record year, 2020. And this year, we probably are going to double that. In terms of IPO exits of technology companies, for the first 3 quarters of this year, Israeli technology companies recorded exits in excess of $19 billion. And when I refer to exits, I mean both in terms of IPOs, SPACs, and M&A. The volumes are very significant. More than 20 Israeli companies have completed this year their IPO, either through a regular IPO or through a SPAC transaction in the US. 45 companies to date have listed on the TASE here in Israel. And more companies are looking to Canadian stock, to the Canadian markets. For many years, Israeli companies have looked at North America, the US primarily, but also Canada as the primary market, and that continues. So there are many opportunities here for Canadians. It starts with early stage startups, and it continues with growing companies, and then with mature companies, and it crosses the technology ecosystem here is very deep. The cyber is a leading area, and also fintech. I think this year, for the first time, fintech companies have surpassed the cyber. But there is a very vibrant scene around agri-tech and food tech and healthcare, digital healthcare in particular, enterprise software, AI. We are really at the forefront of the global technology. So I think it's almost as if the opportunity is endless.
Thanks, Aviram. That's a great introduction, and we're going to get into some of these areas more specifically in a moment. Sion, let me turn to you. You're a founder and managing partner of the Group Ventures, which is a VC firm based here in Toronto, and your firm invests in AI, financial services, retail, loyalty, healthcare, and manufacturing sectors. Now, I know you've invested in a number of Israeli companies like Tactile Mobility and Murado, and I see you're also involved in iAngels, a women-led VC firm and investment platform targeting Israeli tech startups. So tell us what areas of Israeli tech you would recommend an interested Canadian investor focus on these days.
Yeah, I mean, look, Israel is such a mature ecosystem, and I think there is an abundance of opportunities across sectors. We don't invest in it, but biotech, medical device is a big market, as Aviram mentioned, cybersecurity, automotive. Israel is quickly becoming also a powerhouse there. I think looking beyond industries as a sector, what Israel really has a strength in relative terms, I'd say is in true deep tech enterprise solutions. I mean, you are seeing a lot of Israelis in the B2C space, that some new unicorns there, but really, if you look, I think across the board, and we're always generalizing, there's a problem with that. But if you look at deep tech enterprise B2B solutions, I think that's really where the strength is. I don't think there's a relative strength in Israel for pure B2C markets, for example, or industry. So if people are looking at Israel, that's where I'd say, again, on a relative basis, look at those type of companies. Sorry, Ted, I think you might be frozen. Yeah, looks like we lost Ted. Yeah, and I don't know, maybe we can just fill it up here without Ted for a second. Aviram also mentioned kind of the crazy numbers that are going on in Israel in the last kind of year, and but I think also one needs to look a little bit deeper than just the absolute numbers, because those are breaking records across the board everywhere. I mean, the US Canada is also having a great year as far as that's concerned. But what really I think is interesting about Israel when we looked at it and analyzed it, it's you look at the ratios, and again, when I say relative terms, you look beyond them. Arguably, Israel is the most capital efficient place to invest in tech today. I mean, if you factor in size of exits, clearly US Valley, you have bigger exits, although this year that's also changing. But if you factor in size of exits, how fast it takes to get to an exit. So Israel numbers show tech companies get to an exit faster than anywhere else. How much money they need in order to get to an exit. Israel, again, happens faster than anywhere else. Exit ratios per startup, Israel is one of the best. So when you factor all of that together, I'd say arguably Israel is probably one of the most capital efficient places to invest in tech in the world today, which is also a great reason, an exciting reason to look at it, just again, beyond the absolute number.
I think we have Ted back. So yeah, go ahead.
So that's please. Why I stopped talking. Ted's here.
Sion, that was a great answer. I mean, that was wonderful. I'm wondering if anyone else, I will let Ted take it, but I'm wondering if anyone else has any other comments with respect to what Sion talked about, just about the interesting aspect of the efficiency of capital in Israel. Could I ask anyone just to, I mean, is that the reason, just out of interest?
Well, I think, if I may jump in, there are many reasons. I think the efficiency is one of them, even though there's a challenge that Israel is becoming expensive. There's a huge competition for talent. So what we see are especially the salaries going up. So that may impact the future competitivity in that respect. But I think Sion mentioned a lot of factors why Israel is so interesting. I mean, it's a small country with a very dense network. Everyone knows each other, so it's relatively easy to do business. There's a great support from the government. It's actually what I always like to say is in Israeli. It's one of the few areas where the government has done a lot of good work. Over the last 30 years already. I mean, you see leading universities stepping in, so that triangle between businesses, startups, and universities, supported by the government, that's also working. But I think eventually it all comes down to the DNA of the Israelis that like to invent, that sometimes obnoxiously think they know everything better, which is something that's very helpful in this startup environment.
Success story that might illustrate that, your answer.
Sorry, Ted, you were on mute.
If we just go back, if you can give us a success story, it's a question for Sion.
Sion, you're also muted.
Sorry, are you asking about the success story of an investment we've made?
Yeah. Yes, I think that was the question.
Yeah. I mean, we're a small investor in the sense of how many deals we do. We're, as far as a firm, we kind of do 2 or 3 deals a year, and we're fairly new in the market. And I'd like to, I think all of our Israeli investments so far have been successful. Maybe a notable one would be an investment we made, one of the first investment we made actually as a fund. It's probably 3.5 years ago now that we've been working with Belong.life. And it's a classic story of repeat entrepreneurs, which is another another thing you see in Israel because of its maturity. Lots of repeat entrepreneurs that have done it, sold companies for even number of companies. So these guys sold. This is their 4th. They've sold 3 before. They for what you'd call modest numbers, around $100 million. range, went, worked at large organization, in this case, EMC, came back and said, okay, we want to now build something and scale it. This is that move that Israel's done that Aviram talked about, from startup nation to scale up nation. In the digital healthcare space, looking at how can we help people manage their disease progression, starting in cancer. 4 years later, belongs today the world's largest social network for cancer patients, for MS patients, IBD patients. It's the #1 patient engagement platform in the world today as far as engagement metrics are concerned. Its growth has been absolutely phenomenal. But again, deep tech, strong understanding, repeat entrepreneurs, in a double-sided market, so B2B and B2C aspect to it. All of those kind of tick boxes that you'd look at an Israeli tech company and why you would invest in, they kind of met it, and the metrics, the growth metrics are there to show for it.
That's great. Thanks, Sion. Let me turn to Igal Ohayon of NA Ventures. You're based in Tel Aviv. You were formerly based in Montreal, and you're a director on the investment team at NA Ventures. You're also sit on the board of a number of the portfolio companies. NA Ventures is an arm of National Bank, and it's focused on fintech investments. So fintech in Israel, as I think has already been mentioned, is an area that's seeing a lot of interest from foreign investors. What kind of activity are you seeing that a Canadian fintech investor might not find in Canada?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would start, but I think it's important to note that at the bank, we use the term fintech in a much broader form because our investments are strategic in nature, and I'll get into that later. But really, any technology that can be useful for the operations of a financial institution is what we consider fintech. So a fintech in its purest form, a cybersecurity company, or any kind of enterprise software company, a data company, whatever it may be. But to answer the question, and by our definition of fintech, a key sector that brought us to Israel and that attracted us to really have the bank relocate one of its employees for the first time ever in this country is cybersecurity. I think it was mentioned by Aviram earlier, but as many of you know, Israel is recognized for its advances in this sector, and it's also no secret that cyber is top of mind for any large enterprise these days. Aside from cybersecurity, we've also witnessed strong growth in the fintech space over the last few years in Israel. And when we compare fintech between Canada and Israel, the truth is, or not fintech, but really the financial sector between the two countries, the truth is that there are more similarities than differences. But the main differences would probably be that Israel is more advanced when it comes to technologies based on academics, so deep tech integrated into a fintech product. But we see that more often in Israeli companies than we do in Canadian and sometimes even US companies. But in terms of similarities, both countries have a very tightly regulated banking system, which is often a roadblock for innovation. And that's why we need this deep technology to try and circumvent the regulations and while staying compliant, of course. Also, both countries have a very resilient, a very stable banking system with high liquidity. And in terms of demographic, or you'd say that, low population relative to the size, Canada is a much bigger country, but relative to its size, it's a pretty low population, and there are lots of players in the banking system. So competition is extremely high in both countries. So the same banks are competing for the same customers. And so innovation is in the long term going to be what is going to allow us to remain, competitive.
Thanks. Maybe just quickly, can you also give us an investment success story for NA Ventures in Israel, and maybe comment on lessons you've learned from the experience that you might pass on to other Canadian investors?
Yeah, that's an interesting one for us because my role in Israel is a hybrid role. So I am an investor. I have a business background, not a technology one, but we invest in Israel in two different ways. We invest by purely investing in companies that we feel are promising businesses, but we also, my mandate has also been to scout for technologies in Israel that may be useful for the bank, and those companies don't necessarily end up being on my investment pipeline, but we do give business to Israeli-based companies by doing so. Today, there's a handful of Israeli companies that the bank is working with across many different business lines, companies that I've identified and presented to the relevant business units, but for different reasons, we haven't invested in these companies. So maybe they're already unicorns, or maybe they're not seeking financing at this time, or maybe we just don't believe in the business model. Now, on the investment front, I've been based in Israel for less than a year now. Started in January here, and we've already concluded, as was mentioned previously, 2 investments. One of them is in a company called 𝗬𝗂𝗃, with a CX at the end, so customer experience. The company helps digitize customer experiences, taking manual processes and turning them into a fully digital end-to-end experience. And their technology is currently being deployed inside the bank across various processes that are existing but manual. We've made an investment in the company. We appear on their cap table as a flagship customer, which gives them a lot of credibility. And at the same time, they can tell their future investors that their clients are investing in their company. In terms of lessons learned for other Canadian investors, I think a lot of investors, or even potential clients, because we sometimes just buy products from Israeli companies, are not aware that Israeli companies commercialize in North America and they develop in Israel. So it's very similar to dealing with a local company in many ways. And at the bank, we've had many interactions with Israeli companies, both from a commercial interaction, so business lines, not from investment perspectives. Over the last year, that went very smoothly. And really, there's, yes, it is a 7-hour difference, but most of the time, the sales teams and really everything around commercialization is based on Eastern or Western time zone. And so, yeah.
Great, thanks, Igal. Gideon, let me turn to you now. You're the co-founder and managing partner of GreenSoil Investments, a climate tech-focused VC firm, and I think it's approximately $150 million you have under management. And I understand your ag and food tech funds, which are based out of the Radana offices, have invested exclusively in Israel, while GreenSoil PropTech Ventures, which invests in companies that provide technologies to make real estate more productive, efficient, sustainable, is managed out of your Toronto offices here. And I believe it mostly invests in North America. And I think you've recently begun to invest in Israeli ventures. So I'm going to ask Ido in a moment about cannabis specifically, but first, Gideon, can you tell us more generally about agri-tech and food tech, that scene in Israel? What kind of advances are you seeing in these sectors?
Gideon, you're on mute.
So ag and food tech is pretty amazing sector in Israel. We started 10 years ago, and we did so because on the one hand we saw an enormous need, growing population worldwide, need to feed the people. There's not enough there, but also big climate impact from the agricultural sector, scarcity of water, scarcity of other resources. So there was this need. And then on the other hand, in Israel, there was the beginning of an amazing ecosystem with a lot of innovation. It already started historically. I mean, if you look at a technology of breeding, it's already mentioned in the Bible. but also historically in the last 100 years, kibbutzim and moshavim being very active in developing agtech. Within the agriculture sector, with some of the best universities in Israel, for example, the Weizmann Institute or the agriculture department of the Hebrew University. We saw a lot of the large corporates, companies like PepsiCo, Yara, and others coming to Israel to look for innovation. So there was really all these ingredients for a pretty amazing sector that in the last 10 years developed so much that today we have around 400 startups in agtech and another 400 in food tech. Now, just to put that in perspective, if you take an average of, let's say, 10 employees per startup, so that's 800 times 10, that's 8,000 people working in ag and food tech. That's around 1 in every 1,000 people in Israel is working in an ag or food tech startup. So that's why we decided to focus on that sector.
That's great. Let me switch it over to Ido and focus on something very particular. You're a founder and the CEO of BetterSeeds, which uses genome editing technology to produce new crop varieties. I understand one of BetterSeeds' goals is increasing the profitability of cannabis farming, which is near and dear to the hearts of many Canadian investors. I've also read that BetterSeeds has been named by Food Hack as one of the 15 companies in the world working on genetically edited crops that could transform farming and food, which is very impressive. So Gideon talked more generally about agritech, but can you talk a little bit about the Israeli agritech innovation in the cannabis industry, and also why you think Canadian investors should be interested in this particular area?
Well, I'm actually going to combine Gideon's answer with my comment, my perspective at least. I think the most interesting process that we're seeing now in cannabis is, as it's becoming more legitimate, or the perception of it is becoming more legitimate, we're actually seeing more crossover of, you could say, the conventional agritech companies entering the cannabis businesses. Instead of just having cannabis entrepreneurs, you're already starting to see certain agritech companies entering the market. And because also the Israeli cannabis regulatory authorities have developed a very easy and accessible platform for R&D, I believe that that will enable the Israeli cannabis sector to develop products much more readily, based on solutions that have already been developed or at least adapted for the conventional businesses. So I believe that the most interesting process that we're seeing in the cannabis sector is the crossover from the conventional agritech into the cannabis businesses. And by the way, BetterSeeds is very much done the same way. We came for the conventional agritech business, and we saw an opportunity and we saw a gap, and we jumped in and we utilized our know-how and have provided a solution also for cannabis. You're on mute, Ted.
Oh, thanks. Thank you. Thanks, Ido. We've talked about the many opportunities in Israeli tech. So let me turn to Igal on the topic of the benefits for an Israeli company to source investment from Canada. From your perspective, Igal, as a Canadian institutional investor, what can you offer an Israeli company besides the obvious, which is money?
Yeah, so really, as an investor today, if you only offer money, good luck investing in the right companies with all the capital that there is out there. And because we invest strategically, again, our investments are only in companies where we see a product that can help National Bank of Canada innovate in one way or another. And so because we invest in companies that we also sell internally to the business units, we help our investees navigate the structural complexities of the bank, connecting them exactly with the stakeholders that they need to be talking to. As I'm sure you can imagine, a company with over 25,000 employees, a simple LinkedIn search won't cut it for the sales guys. And so bottom line, we act as the flagship customer giving the early stage companies sort of the seal of approval that we are using this technology, and perhaps as a result, TD Bank or RBC will follow suit, and they'll be able to sign on other large customers. And so, yeah, that's how we've been. That's been our value proposition since the beginning, and it's been quite a successful one.
Okay, makes sense. Ido, let me go back to you.
I'll add a point about NA and the work they've done. So a little bit off topic for what we're saying, but as a strategic banking investor, they're one of the best we've seen. We've worked with them for a while, and the work they've done and how they work with startups. So if there are any other startups out there looking for money, and I'd say NA is probably one of the best we've seen as far as a bank working with technology companies.
Great. All right. Thanks for adding that. Ido, let me turn to you for a different perspective on the same topic. I understand you raised money from Canadian investors, and in fact, I think you're considering listing BetterSeeds on a Canadian stock exchange. So is there anything about the Canadian financial markets, Canadian investors that you find more attractive for your company compared to all the other options that are out there?
So me as an Israeli startup company, I was deliberating whether we should go to an IPO, either Tel Aviv, NASDAQ, or Toronto. So for me, those were the three obvious choices. And actually, I am aiming, or at least I am attracted very much to the Canadian market. And I would say that one of the reasons is very obvious, is that the Canadian investors are very much positive for the Israeli technology companies, which makes me, of course, my affinity to Canada much higher. And I would say also, me coming from the genetics and the agri-tech business, I find the Canadian investors much more sophisticated than the Israeli investors. So that's why Tel Aviv stock exchange for me is much less interesting than the Canadian market, especially when we're talking about long-term investments that require quite a lot of fund and quite a lot of patience. So that is how Toronto overshadows, I believe, the Tel Aviv stock exchange. Everything is from my perspective, by the way. It's all my opinions. And I would say also, if I had to compare the process in NASDAQ and Toronto, then I would say that actually one of the more attractive attributes of Toronto is that the process seems to be much more easier and, of course, much more cost efficient, which is a very crucial point for a small Israeli startup who have to finance this process of listing on a stock exchange, a foreign stock exchange. And again, after talking to quite a lot of Canadian investors, I found that Canada, at least, is much more open or much more positive to agri-tech technologies than NASDAQ. Maybe NASDAQ is more fitting for other technologies, more high-tech technologies. In agri-tech, I actually find the Canadian market much more positive than the NASDAQ. So these are the main points and reasons why I believe that Canada, for me as an Israeli company, is much more attractive.
Great. That's great to hear as a Canadian. So let's talk about differences now between Canada and Israel. Aviram, let me go back to you. You work with clients around the world. You've actually practiced law in the US, UK, and in Israel. So I think you're well placed to comment on the differences between doing deals in Israel versus doing deals outside of Israel. If you were speaking to a seasoned Canadian investor, what would you highlight to them about investing in Israel for the first time? Should they expect differences in the structure of the deal or the legal regime or how the deal gets done? Or would you say it's a fairly similar experience?
So as you thanks Ted for the question. As you mentioned, I before joining Herzog, I had worked for 7 years with the leading US law firm, 4 years out of the New York office and then 3 years out of their London office. And I came back to Israel 9 years ago and joined Herzog. And one of the things that I'm most proud about, hopefully it's okay to be proud about, is that I'm yet to write one agreement in Hebrew. All the Israeli technology companies in particular, but also others, everybody nowadays work in English, and since most of the companies' markets are located outside of Israel, Israeli companies look for outside all the time, and they would like to become global companies and to expand globally. And many of them look into North America as their primary market. And so many, and so in many sense, I think it's like doing deals with US companies in the field of interest with European companies. It's our legal system originated from UK law, but over the years we've imported many Delaware law concepts. Most agreements here are US style still, but we know how to handle UK style as well, and also Canadian style. We're learning more and more, and hopefully that will continue. I really, I mentioned before that Israeli technology companies raised $18 billion in private investment since the beginning of the year, and 75% of that amount comes from foreign investors, and also the quarter that comes from Israeli investors. Most of this is Israeli VC funds, which include many foreign LPs. So, it's all very international here, and in that regard, I think the environment is relatively friendly.
Great. So Canadian investors should feel right at home.
Yeah.
Gideon, let me ask you as well about the differences, if any. As mentioned, while GreenSoil, Ag and Food Technologies, I understand, is based in Israel and invests locally, GreenSoil PropTech Ventures is based in Toronto, and you've invested in companies like CarbonCure in Halifax and ThoughtWire in Toronto. So would you say that investing from Canada or investing into Canadian companies requires a different approach than doing it in Israel with Israeli companies?
Yeah, I think it's pretty different. I mean, first of all, the obvious one is that in Israel you can invest with a T-shirt, and in Canada you need a warm coat. But putting that aside, first of all, for Canadian investors going to invest in Israel, the question is, what type of investor do you want to become? For those people that want to be a passive investor, my biggest recommendation is go always through a local platform, because you need a local platform to get the best deals. What we've heard all over from all the speakers today is that the Israeli high tech is becoming a large, professional, rich sector. So for Canadians who want to be passive, to think that they can get to the best deals, it simply won't happen, because the best deals go to the best investors. That's what's happening in the ecosystem today. And to be honest, unfortunately, I've met too many Canadians that said, hey, I met this neighbor of my cousin and he has a cool startup. Israeli startups are all cool. So I invested money, and surprise, surprise, they lost the money. Because besides all those wonderful unicorns and success stories, there are also still a lot of companies that don't make it. So in that point, if you want to be passive, great, but go through a local platform. For active investors, the difference is here that you need to show your added value. And if you want to show your added value in Canada, well, when you are an investor in Canada, it's much easier, because the Canadian sector is a little bit more local. Companies in Canada tend to be more focused the first couple of years on the Canadian market. Whereas, and I think some of you said it before, Israeli companies, because the Israeli market itself is so small, they go global from day one. So for an investor stepping into an Israeli company, it's really important to help that Israeli company to become a global company. And one of the ways to do so is to provide Canada as a bridge towards the largest North American market, obviously also to help them to go into the United States. So I think that's one difference, the local versus the global perspective. I think the other way is also the way business is being done. Israelis are quick. They want to come to a conclusion fast. In the first meeting, they would love to know, is there going to be a deal here or not? Whereas the Canadians tend to have a little bit more process-oriented process, going through all the motions. And I think for Canadians who want to be successful in Israel, it's important to understand that difference in DNA, that as we say in Israel, the Israelis are looking for the tachlis, like what's in it for me, can we get a deal, why would I take you as an investor? And I think that's the last thing I would say for Canadian investors that want to be successful in Israel, be prepared for those direct questions. There's not a lot of long schmoozing going on. It's immediately like, okay, who are you? Why do you want to invest in my company? What strategic value can you bring to me? And please give me the answer. And if you don't have the answer, well, I'm going to the next meeting. It's sometimes perceived impolite, but it's also very efficient and fast.
Thanks. I mean, that's a great segue into the next question I want to ask Sion about business culture. So you've got portfolio companies in Canada and Israel, so I think you're in a great position as well to address this. From a business culture perspective, what would you say are the key differences, good and bad, in investing in Israeli companies versus investing in Canadian companies?
Yeah, I mean, I'd echo a lot of what Gideon said. I think trying not to be too repetitive here. There is the Israeli tech ecosystem is a very mature ecosystem. Again, relative to the Canadian one, which is a great tech ecosystem. We're big believers in it. We're investing in it, but it's not a mature ecosystem yet. And part of it is business processes and how people work and talent. But you tend to find a very, very high sense of urgency, and that may be a cultural thing. That Canadian tech ecosystem and founders and entrepreneurs tend to lack often. I hate generalizing because you're always making a mistake when you're doing it. But that sense of urgency, the understanding of how important time is to get to the bottom line, to get to where you need to get faster, you do tend to see that more in Israeli with Israeli founders and entrepreneurs than you do in the Canadian ones. And again, it may be also a result of maybe cultural. I think also a lot of it is experience, just understanding that time is everything in venture capital. It's all a function of time and how fast you grow and how fast you sell or all of those things. So, but I'd say that was the biggest thing that we kind of test for when we look at entrepreneurs here, that we try and find also in Canadian investments, that sense of urgency in everything they're doing, including dealing with us. And again, it ties back to what Gideon said about this need for this tachlis. Okay, what's happening? It can hurt Israeli companies as well, particularly when you look at large kind of long cycle enterprise sales deals and things like that, where you really need to look at it from a longer term business development. So Israelis tend to not be great at that. But even there, again, because of the maturity, because there's so many people already that have done this, are doing this. So there's a lot of talent that understands and has that experience to do it as well.
Thanks. That's great insight. Let's switch to our last topic, and our time is running short. So I'll ask the panel members, please, to keep your answers brief. But let me turn to Gideon to address this first. But we've talked about all of the great investment opportunities in Israel. But as my Bennett Jones colleague, Elad Travis, mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, relative to the US and many other countries, Canadians are not investing as much in Israel. So Gideon, why do you think that is? Do investors prefer to invest closer to home, or is it just that Israel's not on their radar?
Well, first of all, I think Israel is becoming more and more a place on the radar. I meet more and more Canadian investors that want to learn about the Israeli story, that want to invest in Israel. Then they understand that Israel is becoming a mature, professional, and successful ecosystem. Still, having that said, obviously, it is a 12-hour flight away. If you want to be a value-add investor, it's difficult to do it over Zoom. You need to meet the people, especially when you deal with Israelis. And also for Canadians that tend to be a little bit more focused on their local market, when they get already over that hurdle and they start looking at global opportunities, it's much easier for them to go over the border south and invest in this huge American opportunity where they speak the same language and have a culture that is still a little bit more similar than going to the Middle East and invest there. So I don't think it's illogical. It's natural. It is changing. And I think that the better the Israelis are getting and the better the results are getting, the more Canadians we will see. And I think, if I may summarize that part, all of us here are happy to help anyone from Canada that wants to invest in Israel to do it in the best, most professional and easiest way.
Great, thank you. Aviram, over to you on the same theme of the reasons why investors might not be investing in Israel. And I'm wondering about the political angle. Sadly, there's many people out there who express opposition to investing in Israel for political reasons. I know you worked on the purchase by PepsiCo of SodaStream, which had its share of negative public attention. Is this something that actually comes up? Do clients actually say that they have to be mindful of political considerations when they're investing in Israel?
Well, so this issue obviously has some history and you know, but the example that you gave, the PepsiCo transaction, this issue had never been discussed. I mean, the business opportunity there for PepsiCo was so compelling, and there were so many synergies that I think the BDS and some other noise that has been made during the negotiation or once the deal became public really was almost ignored. I think that, look, Israel has been living in the midst of some significant political conflicts. Those conflicts still exist. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict and Israel conflict with certain of its neighbors, primarily Iran and Syria and Lebanon. This is already here. I think that for the last few years, the volume that Israelis and others have been dealing with those conflicts has decreased to some extent because of COVID and because of other geopolitical reasons. But I think that the Israeli technology ecosystem or the business ecosystem here has continued to grow significantly despite all of that, and has learned to live with that. And in fact, the Abraham Accords that were signed over a year ago with the UAE, with Bahrain, and with Morocco actually have really injected a significant sense of optimism into the region and into the business ecosystem here. I think, and actually opened a whole range of new opportunities for Israelis and also for foreign investors, including Canadians. Israel suddenly has become a gateway to get into collaboration with significant UAE and other companies and bodies. You've seen many Israelis travel on business to the UAE. I mean, last year, I think at least in 2 instances, there were very significant technology conferences held in Dubai, and you saw really the elite of the Israeli business community traveling back and forth to Dubai, and you see also business people from the UAE and from Bahrain coming here as well all the time. So actually, in that regard, I think the environment has improved significantly.
And Ted, if I just may add 20 seconds, I think Aviram said, despite the conflict, let's also not forget that because of the conflict, we have partly a very successful high tech. I mean, cybersecurity would not be #1 worldwide without the conflict. And the fact that so many 18-year-old Israelis go into army units where they're being trained to become the best programmers and developers is also something that has been extremely helpful for the Israeli high tech.
Yeah, that makes sense. Great, thank you. Igal, let me give you the last word on this. Given what others have said in this webinar on the topic, what do you think we can do to encourage more Canadian investment into Israel? Are there psychological or other roadblocks that we need to remove?
It's a question that I tend to struggle with, but I'll give you my take on it. I can say that for National Bank, a pretty significant financial institution in Canada, we managed to leave out political and other types of irrelevant roadblocks when it comes to doing business. But if I take a step back, Canada is not the US. I think the underlying thought here is that we invest less than the US, but the reality is that Canada is not the US. We're far from the size of the US economy. And then to that, you add the Jewish diaspora presence in the US versus Canada. And I agree with Gideon, who said that Canadians like to stay local or sometimes go south of the border. We just tend to be more conservative in the way we do business. And I think the best example you can have here is my situation. So I don't think that National Bank would have a presence in Israel today if it wasn't for this nice Jewish boy who's been lobbying the idea internally for years. And really, you have a lot of that in the US. So JP Morgan, for example, is present in Israel. And it started exactly the way I started here. It was one Jewish employee in New York who had an idea, and they shipped him over to Israel. And today there are over 150 employees in IT, in tech jobs. I'm not speaking about their commercial operations or commercial banking operations in Israel. And so it's an interesting situation where, if we do our job and we lobby the opportunities that are present in Israel to other Canadians, I think we can continue to grow investments into Israel. Yeah.
That's great. Thanks. Good advice. So I think our time for the panel is up. I want to thank the panel again for the informative session. I think we have time for a couple of questions. Let me turn it over to Elad and let us know if there are some questions that the audience has posed.
We have now so far. Thank you, Ted, for a very interesting discussion. And now one question from the audience. It's a question for Gideon. In what manner do ESG, environmental, social, and governance, and food security and financial reporting fit into your investment strategies and into the Israeli tech market in general?
So for us, it's very important. It is key. So in our PropTech fund, we invest at least 2/3 of our funds into companies that have a clear carbon emission reduction impact. But we also look at other impacts, whether it is environmental or social. We look at low income advantages in PropTech. Of course, in AgTech, we look at the ability to deal with scarce resources. I talked earlier about water security. So for us, it's very important. We also, before we invest, we want to make sure that the companies we invest in themselves have a clear ESG policy. And we definitely see ourselves as double bottom line investors. We want to see that financial return, but we also want to see that social return.
Thank you, Gideon. And now turning it to Oded for some closing remarks.
Well, first of all, again, gentlemen, thank you. That was tremendously informative, and I very much appreciate it for your insight from all of you and the time you've spent with us today. As someone who just returned from Israel on Sunday, If I may add one very brief editorial, and I want to build on a little bit what Igal said and some others, it's my personal feeling and what I experienced over the last week and a half in Israel is the maturation of the capital markets, both in Israel and in Canada, which is opening up doors for both countries to expect that. And on the Israeli side, it's the recognition that you don't have to be a unicorn. I think that was something that someone had commented earlier, that there are wonderful market cap companies in the 100 million or even less range. And on the Canadian side, whereas perhaps 10 or 15 years ago, the investment banks and Igal's National Bank would focus strictly on gold and mining or issuances of other big banks, they're now more open because of success stories that are both Canadian and Israelis to other sectors. So again, that's just my personal editorial. I think Igal made a good point. We have to recognize in Canada, we are not the United States. We are a much smaller market, but again, that we can punch above our weight. And thanks to organizations and law firms like Bennett Jones and Elad and Ted, who are leading the charge. So thank you very much, everybody, for attending. Elad, I don't know if you want to make one closing remark. I'll just briefly say that for people who know, we have our next event, and please stand by on December 9th with the Canada-Israel Chamber. We look forward to perhaps speaking with our guest speakers in the future and having them participate in a different event with us. So Elad, over to you. Thank you for being a great sponsor, Ted, as well, for moderating, and looking forward to speaking to all of you offline. Over to you, Elad.
Thank you, Oded. This concludes our webinar. I would like to thank our panelists for taking the time to share their knowledge and experiences. Feel free to reach out to any of them. We encourage you to join the 𝗦𝘂𝗰𝗶𝗃𝗁 LinkedIn group and to connect with Ted, Aviram, and myself on LinkedIn or by email, as well as sign up to the Canada-Israel Chamber of Commerce newsletter on the Chamber's website. Thank you all for watching. Stay tuned for updates on additional Canada-Israel webinars in the coming months. I'd like to wish everyone Chanukah Sameach, happy holiday season, and best wishes for the new year.